And we are live. Umoya Ulight, Umoya Bright. Welcome to another Moya live stream where we stream with our elders and we try to understand our history. We try to understand the past, the present, and the future so that we can place ourselves in this whole mess that's going on. Last time we had Ndate Steve on Sharpeville Day and he gave us a history of what happened, what preceded Sharpeville days, the years before that. And then I spoke to him this week, and he told me that there's a concept called Black Wednesdays from the struggle era, and it has to do with Black radicals and the history of Black radicalism. So, how did we get here as people who are so pan Africanist and pro African messages? How did it actually start? Because we are not the beginning of it, seemingly. We are not that creative, and it's not us. We're actually taking from somewhere. So our elders are now coming to us to say, no, 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 you're not that magical. You did not suck it out of the ether. It's actually that you're picking up vibrations of things that have been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Yeah.
So in that Steve, you know me, I always just listen. So we
Yeah.
can start where you want to start and give us this history. It's so exciting. I never knew about Black Wednesdays, but I'm looking forward to hearing about it today. Dimelang Tate.
Hey, Tiki, how are you?
Raphila Tate. We are step by day, step by step.
Okay.
Eh.
Yes, I think a lot of people, would have either heard about Black Wednesday or they would have read about it. Now, Black Wednesday actually happened in 1977. It was on the 19th of October, 1977. And uh, the gist of it, is that it entailed the banning of all political, cultural, social, and also religious formations, that were affiliated to the Black consciousness movement. Now, at the apex of the Black consciousness movement was, in fact, the Black People's Convention, which was established in 1972. But BPC would have been the political vehicle and the political arm of the Black consciousness movement. But its beginnings were actually in universities. And the one university that would have been, at the forefront of it would have been the University of Natal at the time. The Black section of it, where Steve Biko was, in fact, a student. And the whole, doctrine and body of knowledge that came to be known as Black consciousness philosophy actually originated with Steve Biko. But the idea here was, Black consciousness would have had a set of outcomes that it set for itself. But the most important here, and one that we hardly ever talk about, is the fact that Black consciousness was actually created as a vehicle to advance Black emancipation. Now, these are terms that have actually fallen into abeyance, particularly as a result of Black consciousness being either misinterpreted and minimized and actually misrepresented. And we will show that this was an undertaking not only of the apartheid state, but of certain particular powerful forces and interests, inside South Africa. So when we talk about the systematic assault on the Black radical tradition, it is not only the apartheid state that we have to identify as having been determined, to destroy and to debilitate as much as it could, black radical thought that was expressed in black consciousness or in the black consciousness philosophy. Now, there are a number of developments that took place between the moment when black consciousness philosophy was instituted, and this was in 1968, when students who were members of the National Union of South African Students, or NUSAS, the black students who were members of NUSAS at the time, decided that NUSAS was not a proper vehicle to advance what they understood as black emancipation. And for that reason, they decided to walk away from NUSAS. And in 1969, they established the South African Students Organization. Now, that would have been the beginnings of black consciousness and the black consciousness movement. But the issue here is that the philosophy and the set of ideas that it propagated did not only begin in 1968 or in 1969. We have to go back in history to try and establish, certain forces and developments that would have been the genesis, of the black consciousness philosophy and also of the black consciousness movement. Now, the one thing that we do not do in South Africa, and this also has to do, with the ways in which black consciousness and the black radical thought has actually been received in South Africa. The one thing that is actually evident, but we don't actually get into, and here I'm talking about, intellectuals and academics who reflected on the lifespan of the black consciousness movement and the black consciousness philosophy. It is to try and trace its origins, not in 1968 or in white campuses, but to go back in history and look at the history of resistance, particularly in the 20th century. There is no doubt, that the 19th century would have represented the high mark of, resistance against colonialism. But in the early 20th century, there were particular forms of resistance that in themselves can be defined as black radical forms of expressions. And in the period between the two wars, in 1919 to 1939, there was a mass movement, a very vibrant mass movement in South Africa, which was associated with the Garvey movement in the USA. And the reason for that is actually, in fact, that the leadership of the mass movement of the 1920s associated their organizations with the Garvey movement in the US. So when we talk about Africa for the Africans, this is the slogan that comes out of the Garvey movement. And in fact, the quest for a black republic, are two of the most important symbols, of black radical thought in the period I'm referring to. And the political organizations that emerged out of that period can actually be classified as black radical formations. But you may wonder where the ANC would have been in this period. Let me not spend too much time on it, except to say that historically, this is the one period, in the period, the 20 years between the wars, when the ANC was rather, inactive for a number of reasons that have been explored. So if there was resistance at all, it would have been other organizations, most of them, being regional, such as, the Wellingtonian movement in the Eastern Cape, or the ICU in the Free State, or even the ICU in parts of the Western Cape, and in particular in Cape Town. And all of these regional organizations, all of them had one thing in common. They were inspired by a black radical thought, a black radical thinking about how the relationships of domination and exploitation of black people can actually be resolved. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that Black consciousness as a philosophy, may have been inspired by every other thing, including the Black Power movement in the US. But to understand Black consciousness fully and to be able to unpack some of its complexities, we would do well by situating its origins, in the mass movement of the 1920s and 1930s, which is the period that I'm actually referring to. But in the 1940s, there would be, some kind of resistance to colonialism and, to colonial imposition in South Africa. But again, South Africa has this kind of peculiarity that, these kinds of eruptions actually become, regionalized. And in this case, we are moving to the part that actually came to be called the PWV area, or it is Gauteng today. And a great deal of the mass movement of the 1940s actually happens in the PWV area, or as we know it today, in Gauteng. And what we are looking at here, and a phenomenon that is not well understood, in South African historiography, but also in the South African intellectual, and academic world. It is a phenomenon that is not well understood. And this is, the squatter movements of the 1940s, particularly the squatter movement that was led by Sopasonke Mpanza. Now, I would attribute Mpanza's movement to, membership of the Black radical tradition, and actually link it to the Black radical tradition for a number of reasons. If you go back to the 1920s, one of the distinguishing features of that Black radical phenomenon of the 1920s was Ethiopianism, the central role that was played by independent churches, in political formations and in the mass movement of the 1920s. The Mpanza movement was no different in that particular respect. While it was a political movement, it was also a religious, kind of movement. The politics of the mass movement and the squatter movement found expression, in religious symbols. And that way it was, religion and politics were actually collapsed as one into a kind of an ideological construct. Now, historians have actually misunderstood that movement, quite, significantly. But the movement itself emerges at the same time as, and this is important, it emerges at the same time as the ANC Youth League in 1944. So part of what we are looking at here are two strands of Black radicalism. On the one hand, you have the Mpanza movement, which is actually, like I say, one can actually look at its origins, as back in the 1920s. But the ANC Youth League over the years comes to be seen as being Africanist. And it is at this stage that the term Africanist begins to denote a kind of Black radicalism. And that becomes the case throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s. So when we talk about Black radicalism in the 1950s, in terms of what the Black political organizations were doing at the time, the term that we use to describe these is actually Africanist. So in the 1950s, we are looking at the ways in which the ANC would have internalized and actually weaponized, the whole idea of an African nationalism that actually was generated by the ANC Youth League in 1944. Among the four runners, among the leadership and the thinkers about Africanism at this time, these are people that are well known to a lot of you. It is Ashley Pitamda, Robert Sobukwe, and Anton Lembele. But unfortunately, Anton Lembele passed on in 1947. So throughout the 1950s, part of what you are seeing here, is an attempt to articulate a black radicalism within the ANC. And this is done by a group of leadership inside the ANC who are beginning to assume an identity, a distinct identity as Africanists within the ANC. The last time we covered the entire decade of the 1950s, showing how these Africanists inside the ANC were articulating a more black radical position, and were therefore being increasingly marginalized over time. And this should bring us to what is happening today. Today there's talk about reopening the inquest of Chief Albert Luthuli. And this gives us an opportunity to reflect on Chief Albert Luthuli's presidency, particularly in the 1950s. And what we need to look at is the ways in which, Chief Albert Luthuli was able to undermine the Africanist tradition inside the ANC at the time. Now, throughout the 1950s, what we are seeing are tensions, inside the ANC between what becomes the mainstream ANC and the Africanists inside the organization. Now, these tensions played themselves out at different times during the campaigns in the 1950s. The very first campaign of the decade was the May Day protest on the 1st of May 1950. I have covered that protest quite extensively the last time when we spoke. But something that has to come out of it is this, that the Africanist tradition, which would then later become the black radical tradition, particularly in the 1970s, were particularly concerned about what they saw as the interference, of Marxist-Leninists in black struggles at the time. And for them, the ANC should have distanced itself from the May Day protests. Now, that was the first sign of discontent, among the Africanists inside the ANC. But I want you to keep in mind that although we use the term Africanist at this stage in the 1950s, much later that is going to be substituted for a black radical phenomenon, because this is precisely what we are talking about. Like I said, I have actually covered the period 1950 to 1960, leading up to Sharpeville. I think all that I can say for now is that all the campaigns of the ANC in the 1950s did not draw into themselves, that part of the ANC that saw themselves and identified themselves as Africanists. And, over time, they would actually be growing in number and growing in significance. Starting with the defense campaign in 1952, right down to the Women's March in 1956, it became clear at the end of each and every campaign that mass support for these campaigns was not as impressive as it should have been. But the reason for that was that the Africanists were not, absorbed into these campaigns. They were not actually taken aboard. And it is my contention here that to the extent that the ANC may have been seen as a mass movement in the 1950s, this was on account of the Africanists in the movement being connected to the masses. So there was a distinct, difference here between the mainstream ANC leadership and the Africanists inside the movement. But the point I'm making for now is that during that decade when Chief Albert Luthuli was president, the tensions between mainstream ANC and the Africanists in the ANC continued to widen. And by 1957, 1958, it had reached a point of no return. And still Luthuli was the president at the time. But if you think about it, much of the discontent of the Africanists actually centered around Luthuli. And this is, their discontent was precisely that Luthuli had actually outsourced, the ANC's decision-making processes to non-Africans in the, in the organization. We are now talking about the ANC that is part of a Congress alliance, which was formed in 1953. And again, the Congress alliance was one of the issues that the Africanists inside the ANC had serious problems with. But Luthuli was able to navigate his way and actually allow the Congress of Alliance to actually supersede any kind of influences that the Africanists may have had on the organization. The reason I'm bringing him about is to show that he, in fact, was president of the ANC when a black radical, kind of strand was being increasingly and systematically being taken out of the ANC's mainstream, politics and policies. So that by 1959, the Africanists then decided to break away and form the Pan-Africanist Congress. Now, if you ask, where was the PAC the custodian of a black radical phenomenon or of black radical thought? The answer would be most definitely. And going into the 1960s, it becomes apparent that if in South Africa there is, a kind of black radical paradigm, that informs political and social action, that paradigm is in fact to be found inside the PAC, and that is the case from 1960 onwards. But there are a couple of events here which are, again, I'm going to be connecting, what I'm going to say now to the Black consciousness philosophy and how it actually was able to, latch onto the earlier campaigns and earlier political struggles and define itself in those terms. The one thing that has never been spoken about, and the one thing that historians actually avoid to deal with, particularly in the context of political resistance in the 1950s and early 1960s, is in fact the activities of the PAC's armed formation, and that is Biko. Now, in 1961 and 1962, Biko actually undertook a number of campaigns. But again, in 1964 and 1965, Biko was involved in a number of uprisings, particularly in the Eastern Cape, where it was actually responding to some of the land measures, that were being imposed on communities in the Eastern Cape. But in Cape Town and in Paarl, in the Western Cape and in the urban areas of the Western Cape, there was also a very significant presence of Biko. And in 1961 to 1962, there were violent campaigns that were undertaken by Biko. And these violent campaigns actually took a racialist or a racist or a race kind of character. And it is for that reason that Biko was actually being seen as a menace. In fact, when white society spoke about the Swart Gevaar in the 1950s and early 1960s, the Swart Gevaar was actually, understood to be the kind of undertakings that defined Biko itself. Can I take a break?
Oh, yes, you may. Can I also, while you take a break, I seen that there, Steve, you gave a lot of people this link that I gave you, and that's just the speaker link. So everybody who keeps coming into the studio backstage, please can you just go onto YouTube and find Moya YouTube channel, Moya Nziki Mazwai, and you can watch the show from that side. But can people get out of backstage, please? It's very distracting. And also, I want to say to the audience that if you want to comment also, we can only put comments that are on YouTube on screen. So please, can you join us on YouTube on the Moya channel, Moya, Moya Nziki Mazwai, on YouTube. And please, can you guys interact with the guest? You know that Steve, much like
Yes.
what I was saying earlier on, when I was saying that black nationalism didn't just come out of thin air. And you are speaking as if it's coming from Steve Biko in 1977, but it can't possibly be that a black person, say in 1905, wouldn't have noticed the discrepancies, and therefore naturally there would have been a black nationalism. First of all, that's my first question. Then my second question is, why do the white people fear Marxism and Leninism so much? Can I hand the mic back to you?
Yes. Okay. Okay. Can I respond?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, Nsiki, you are right. The one thing, today, in fact, let's start focusing on today. When you think about black radical thought, whether you're talking about black radicalism as an intellectual activity, as an intellectual stroke academic activity, something that is being taught, in lecture theaters, in universities, or you think about black radicalism as, as an instrument of mobilization, because that's precisely what it was. It was an instrument of mass mobilization in 1976 to 1977. But the one thing that young people have to understand today is that, black radicalism of 1976-77, was not perpetuated or did not endure into the 1980s. And it is important to explain why that is the case. The answer to that lies in your second question. You are asking about why is it that white people fear Marxism, Leninism, you said, more than they fear black radicalism. In actual fact, Nsiki, it's the other way around. White society and the white imaginary feared the black peril, the swart gevaar, more than they feared Marxism and Leninism. Now, if we were to segment white society, according to ideological stroke, intellectual, kind of characters, on the extreme right, you have the Afrikaner nationalists. In the middle, you have what we used to refer to as liberals. And then perhaps you have the left wing, or we call it the white left. And that's the Marxist-Leninist group. Now, they have always been there. I mean, you've always had Marxist-Leninist. In terms of South African politics, I mean, from the 1920s, the Third International of that was held in the Soviet Union. All of these were attempts to try and work Marxism and Leninism into the vocabulary of the liberation struggle in South Africa. Now, that happened in the 1920s and 1930s. What you see with the ANC Youth League and the Pan-Africanist movement is a negation of that. So the answer here is that, rather than Marxism and Leninism being a weapon to advance black emancipation, it is actually being used, to counter, the black radical thought and black radical political activity. Let me just give you a quote. And this is a quote, I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm not going to be able to say it as it was written. I'm going to paraphrase it. Thinking about the 1950s and reflecting on the decade in 1959, Joe Slovo wrote in the newsletter of the Congress of Democrats. The Congress of Democrats was a white Marxist-Leninist formation that became part of the Congress alliance with the ANC and the Indian Congresses. Now, he was writing in the newsletter at the end of 1959, reflecting on the 1950s as a decade. What he was lamenting was the fact that since 1948, 10 years earlier, white society had been moving in terms of voting patterns. They were moving towards the right. They were moving towards apartheid. More white people voted for the National Party in 1953 than in 48. And again in 1958, the National Party had a landslide victory. Now, what that actually showed was that white society was embracing apartheid over an extended period of time and accepting it. Now, Joe Slovo was lamenting that, but he told white society to take comfort in the fact that they in the Congress Alliance were able to put a break in black politics so that black politics do not move to the extreme left. And what is that extreme left? It is the black radical extreme left that Joe Slovo was talking about. So in 1959, what he sees as the role of the white left is in fact to counter black politics moving to a black radical kind of character and phenomenon. And this is what Joe Slovo says. Now, after that, within what? 3 months of him having said that, the Sharpeville anti-pass march actually takes place, and the Sharpeville massacre actually happens. What was the Sharpeville massacre in terms of how do we characterize it? No doubt it was a black radical, formation that was at work. It was a black radical thought, that went into mobilizing the masses towards an anti-pass campaign. And why, the brutality that was actually visited upon people in Sharpeville, it was being visited on people, but it was also being visited on the black radical tradition as a mode of thought. So it is actually the black radical tradition that they feared the most. And we have to come to terms with this. Marxism, Leninism was actually used and weaponized against a black radical tradition. When does that actually become even more apparent? It becomes apparent in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday. Because it is in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday that black politics and the resistance movement actually undergo a paradigm shift. It is a paradigm shift from black consciousness to a kind of what we call it a Chaterist tradition, or a tradition of the of Congoloso, or the ANC Chaterist tradition. That is something that we need to explain. If the mass mobilization of the 1970s was inspired by a black radical, thought, and definitely it was black consciousness, how then do we explain that paradigm shift that happens in under 7 years, that the next movement of mass mobilization is now being organized under the auspices of the Congress tradition, of the Chaterist tradition? This is something I really wanted to explain to you. And the reason for that is that you had an interview with Dr. Busak. And in the entire interview, there is no sense of the fact that 1976 was a political event that was inspired by black radical thought. Because for Dr. Busak in Cape Town, what he's not seeing is black consciousness at work. What he's seeing is a kind of reaction to apartheid, which may be defined in other terms, other than what the black consciousness movement was about. So the vocabulary of the black consciousness movement and its association with the black radical tradition is actually found, or it finds expression, in the kinds of uprisings that actually happened again, particularly in the PWV area or in Gauteng. But then the truth is that, over time, the unrest actually spread to other parts of the country. And in some cases, it may have taken a particular, kind of character. But the reality is that the mass movement of the 1970s were inspired by a black radical paradigm. And they were an expression of that paradigm. Okay. Do I continue?
There's a question here. I'm just trying to get it on the screen again. Uqodo, just give me 2 seconds. I don't know why it's not coming on. But basically, the question speaks to what is happening in the ANC today, like with the Cyril Ramaphosa administration. Is it not then just, oh, here's the question. Uti, can you elaborate on how the 1976 riots breathed life into the moribund ANC? I'm assuming you understand what that means?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Ntsiki, there are a lot of things to explain here, but let me be quick about, about this. There is no doubt, that, after 1960, the ANC goes into exile. I think the question talks about that moment when the ANC was moribund. There were two historical moments in the 20th century when the ANC was not in evidence. From 1917, when Sefako Makgatho became president, the ANC was actually descending into obscurity, if you like. And it only comes up, in the 1940s with A.B. Xuma. It is actually revived by A.B. Xuma in the 1940s. And it is actually given a new lease on life by the ANC Youth League in 1944. That's the one moment. The next moment is 1960 to 1975. The Morogoro Conference actually addresses this issue. By 1969, it had become apparent that some people back at home had forgotten what the ANC was and what it was about. And so the Morogoro Conference was then called. One of the resolutions that are taken there is the fact that the ANC has to start making its presence felt back inside the country. And the two people who actually make that argument, and actually, they probably actually rubbed some people up the wrong way, particularly by the ways in which they were criticizing the angst absent from inside the country. One of them was Martin Legacy, and the other was Paula Enzo, who were delegates at the Morogoro Conference. But after the Morogoro Conference, you have yet the re-emergence or the resurfacing inside the ANC of yet another group of Africanists who were still inside the ANC even after the formation of the PAC. Over time, these would be referred to as the Gang of Eight. And these are ANC members who were particularly concerned about the ways in which decision-making processes in the ANC in exile, were passing from African leaders to non-African leaders. I'm using the term non-African leaders here because, of the sensitivity of using racial labels. But you would understand that, we are talking about those that were not Africans. So decision-making processes were passing to, as a result of the formation of the Congress Alliance and the alliances that the ANC had with the SACP and the Indian Congresses. Now, over time, they were writing letters to Oliver Tambo and the ANC leadership. And what they were saying is that, we don't want to be talking to non-African members of the movement. We want answers from Oliver Tambo and from the ANC. And a lot of these had to do with the fact that in the first place, why did you extend membership of the ANC to non-Africans when they themselves have their own ethnic organizations, such as the South African Indian Congress? And those were actually the issues that these Africanists were bringing up, to a point where they were referring to that part of the ANC as Tambo's ANC, distancing themselves from it. But here is an issue. Inside the country, we are now talking beyond 69, into 71, 72, and 73. And inside the country, Black consciousness movement is emerging. 1968-69 SASO is formed. 72 BPC is formed. At the same time, the Black community programs is established, and this becomes a wing that establishes BPC or Black consciousness presence in art formations, in religious bodies, in schools, in high schools, and in universities. So you are having a proliferation of, formations that are affiliated to the Black consciousness movement. And this happens, from 1969, and it picks up momentum from 1972 into 1975. And this is concerning to the exiled ANC, that a Black radical tradition is emerging inside the country. But in exile, they have this group of 8, who are themselves either Pan-Africanist if you are thinking of the 50s, or Black radical if you are thinking of the 70s. And there's concern that, these people are going to be destabilizing the ANC just in case something happens. And indeed, in 1975, Tambo's ANC could not stand these guys any longer. So they wrote letters to them, expelling them from the movement. Now, the 8 of them left the movement. They were led by Tennyson Makiwane. Now, Tennyson Makiwane was actually responsible for establishing the ANC's, exiled mission. He established the ANC in the UK. He was the man behind establishing the diplomatic relations that the ANC had in the United Kingdom. And he was actually behind the formation of the anti-apartheid movement, which had its headquarters in London. But he was also able to negotiate diplomatic relations and connections for the ANC across the African continent. Now, they were quite, Makiwane was leading this group. And in 1975, they were expelled from the ANC. And here is an issue. I mean, at the time, there are new arrivals in exile who are coming out of South Africa. And these are the old guard of the ANC. They had spent 10 years on Robben Island. They were released in 1974. And some of them stayed inside the country, but some left. And one of these you would know, it's Jacob Zuma, actually. So when these people left, they found the ANC at a point at which it was actually ridding itself of the Black radical, any traces of Black radicalism in itself. And the Gang of 8 would have been the last traces of an Africanist stroke Black radical presence inside the ANC. So when the Soweto uprising happens in 1976, the ANC is free of any kind of Black radical influences inside it. Now, what happens to Tennyson Makiwane and his cohorts? What they do is to establish an organization, which was very short-lived. Guess what its name is? They call it the African National Congress of Azania. Now, that tells you it is not the African National Congress of South Africa. It is the African National Congress of Azania. As I say, it was short-lived, but it was still there by 1976 and 1977. And in various places, they tried to link up, very interestingly. They were trying to link up wherever they could with the Pan-Africanist Congress. I know this because in Lesotho, they actually established some working relationship with the PAC. And on the occasion of the commemoration of the 21st of March in 1978, they actually shared a stage with members of the PAC. So, yes, there was, in fact, this also helps what we are trying to forge here, to show that Black consciousness, as a set of ideas that Steve generated, would have had a genesis sometime in the earlier history of resistance in South Africa, from the 1920s into the 1940s and into the 1960s. But here is one last important, fact here that has to be borne in mind. In 1962, at the age of 16, Steve Biko is actually detained, arrested by the police. And this is on suspicion that he was a member, or he was actually an operative of Boko, in the Eastern Cape. This may or may not be true, but the fact that it happened and the fact that the suspicion was that it was because he was an operative of Boko. By the way, he was arrested along with his elder brother, Kaya Biko, and they were kept there for some time. And after some time, they were released. Now, here earlier on, I said, although there may be evidence that would show the origins of Black consciousness philosophy and Black consciousness thought, if we go back to history, there is a certain level of trepidation in actually using that evidence to make certain assertions. And the assertion that I'm making now is that just in terms of his early political molding, Biko had a certain, level of Boko influence in him, and therefore of the Pan-Africanist tradition. So part of what you find in South Africa today is a kind of reluctance, to establish a link between the Black consciousness movement and philosophy and the Pan-Africanist Congress and the Pan-Africanist philosophy. But, if we are brave enough to take the evidence that is available and make use of it to construct a kind of a narrative that would reflect, this kind of link, it is much more than just subliminal. It is actually a material link, that exists between these formations. But we haven't been able to do that. So by 1976, then, you have a situation where the ANC is desperate to establish its presence inside the country. And I refer to a few, of the old guard who were coming out of prison in 1974-75. And they included among them in Durban, it would have been, former President Jacob Zuma. But here in Gauteng, there were quite a few. There was John Nkadimeng, who was a member of the SACP and the ANC. There was Joe Qabi, and Joe Qabi is actually the most recognizable name. And the other was a Henry Makgoti. Now, all these three are credited as having been able to reach out to students who were members of, again, we spoke about the formation of different, organizations by the Black consciousness movement and, BPC, SASO, and other Black consciousness formations. Now, in the high schools, an organization that was established in 1974 was the South African Student Movement. And that movement was also affiliated to, the Black consciousness movement. The one thing that has to be said about the South African student movement is that it opened the door, for students who were probably students a few years before 1976 or before 1974, when SASIM was formed, who were out of school but not in employment. And in parts of Soweto, these students would be found establishing youth clubs, and these youth clubs would actually be reading clubs and other social activities just to get young people busy. But that also offered an opportunity for young people to come together and start discussing politics. And it is in that context that some of these young people identify someone like Joe Qabi, John Nkadimeng, and Henry Makgoti as being the stalwarts of the ANC, and they started, congregating around these people. Joe Qabi became the most prominent, and among those students who got connected to Joe Qabi, they would include the ANC 13, the 13 young men who were recruited and were meant to undertake some sabotage campaigns inside South Africa. And they did, but except that they were captured. Now, again, that's another long story, except to say that one of those that you would recognize in the 13 would be Tokyo Sehwali. The interesting thing here is that the leader of that cell was a man called Naledi Tsiki, not Ntsiki, but Tsiki. And Naledi Tsiki has vanished completely from the scene. And the sense here is that he too got disillusioned at some point. And some people would argue that his disillusionment goes back to as far back as the early 1980s. And we haven't spoken about him. It is Tokyo that is in the limelight. But what that actually represented is the idea that the Soweto uprising was actually engineered by those people who were linked to the ANC in the underground movement. So the contestation here gets to be the Soweto revolt was not a black radical expression. On the contrary, it is an unrest that was orchestrated by the ANC underground. Now, this is the kind of orthodoxy that exists in historical texts today. The book, The Road to Democracy, it is edited by Sfison Ndlovu and Bernard Magubane. It has, 2 chapters on the ANC underground in the period 1960 to 1975. It talks precisely about this. What it does is to displace the Black consciousness movement and philosophy as central to the organization of the mass movement of the 1970s. And it situates the ANC and the Chaterist movement as being at the center of that. What this actually does is to explain, the kind of systematic assault that Black radicalism, as a system of thought, towards a social change, has always been targeted, not only by the apartheid state, but also by established, particularly the ANC, by established political formations, in a tussle for political space. But then June 16 plays itself out, until 1977. And the concern here of the apartheid securocrats was that when it erupted the first time on the 16th of June, expectations were that it will run out quickly and it will vanish. And, by the next day, 17th, we will have forgotten. What was not actually envisaged was the violence that would be generated on the 16th of June. And here is yet another important factor about the 16th of June, which in itself, casts the spotlight on the Black radical tradition as an instrument of mass mobilization. Everybody else seems to think that the most important and significant occurrence was the death of Hector Peterson. The death of Hector Peterson has actually overshadowed everything else about the 16th of June. But there was yet another death on the 16th of June, which has been played down completely. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. The very circumstances of its emergence require that Black radical tradition be misinterpreted and be minimized. Now, let's come back to what this, event is. In White City, once people heard that Hector Peterson had been shot, the entire Soweto was enraged. And in White City, they happened to know that there is a white doctor who came to work on the 16th of June. He did not expect that Soweto would be, engulfed in that level of violence. So he was caught in White City, unable to move out. He was actually taken into a storeroom by those co-workers with him, people who worked with him and who admired him as a person. They were trying to hide him from the violence. But young people in White City were enraged enough. They stormed the clinic and they dragged him out of the clinic. Now, actually, they brutally murdered him, and someone actually drove a pickaxe into his chest, and that's how brutally he was murdered. But what has happened is that the act itself and the event itself has been obliterated completely from history. The issue here is not the violence. The issue here is that what it depicts is what black radicalism can do when driven to extremes. Now, that would be the extreme of black radical political activity. The question is it ethically justifiable? When violence comes from the oppressed to the oppressor, is it justifiable? So what you are seeing with the death of Melville Edelstein is that on the one hand, the black radical tradition does not encourage that sort of violence coming from the oppressed and directed at the oppressor. The understanding of the black radical tradition is rather to invite violence to itself, rather than to visit violence on the oppressor. And that is it is strange how this actually plays itself out in reality. But if you think back in history, the Non-Ngauze episode is precisely about that. It is precisely about black society destroying the material conditions. This is violence against its own material conditions. But the outcome, in fact, is expected to bring about, a better humanity than what you have at this time. So the point I'm making about Melville Edelstein is that for a number of reasons, he had to be obliterated out of history. Black radicalism would find it extremely difficult to really validate that kind of an action. But at the same time, white supremacists would be particularly concerned about such an event actually, imprinting itself on the minds of white society, because what it does would be to enhance white fears. And this is precisely what John Kane Berman actually was writing about in 1977 when reflecting on the events of 1976. The title of his book was Black Riots and White Fears. And what he was actually talking about was the extent to which white fear had been accentuated by the events of 1976. Now, the entire build-up, from 1968 to 1977, was in fact an expression of the black radical tradition. It was an expression of black radical thought. In actual fact, by the 2nd of August 1976, the student movement had actually managed organizationally, to detach itself from the ANC. And this was actually made explicit because what happens is that on the 4th of August, the students call for two kinds of action to be taken. The one was that the working population of Soweto was to stay at home, a kind of a stay away for 3 days, planned from the 4th of August to the 6th, which was a Friday. 4th was a Wednesday to Friday the 6th. That was the plan. And on the same day, students would march into town and actually demand the release of political prisoners, who actually included students. Now, the 4th of August came, and the two things were about to happen. And let me quickly explain here that the stay away, according to the press, was a total success. More than 85% of Soweto's population stayed away from work. And here is an important, rider here. It is that people were not forced to stay away from work. There was no violence directed against those who wanted to go to work. There was an understanding at that time that this is something that needed to be done. And that in itself would have been concerning to the white imaginary and to apartheid securocrats. But more concerning was the reason for students marching into town. Again, it was reflecting on the march on the 16th of June, which started around Soweto but headed for Orlando Stadium. So when violence erupted, such as it did, that violence was contained within the township. So the fatalities would come out of, residents of Soweto and young kids, such as it happened to Hector. So the discussions on the 2nd of August in the SSRC meeting was that the reason the march has to be in town is that when police started shooting, if they would, and we knew they would, this would be within striking distance of white society. There would be collateral damage. That kind of thinking was, in fact, quite alarming, to white securocrats and the white imaginary. And that in itself, was, again, a way in which the student movement was, expressing or establishing the distance, the disconnect between itself and the ANC. Now, throughout August, Soweto was in turmoil. A lot of people died, during that period, following the march into town. Well, up to the end of August. During this period, the apartheid police were trying to capture Tsietsi, but they were unable to. For nearly a month, he was able to evade them, and ultimately he decided to leave and he went to Botswana. Now, it was when he reached Botswana, and again, this is important because it established the relationship between the mass movement back at home and what would become the student movement in exile. Sometime in September, it would have been the third week of September 1976, Tsietsi Mashinini had an interview, an exclusive interview with Dumandlovu, the one of, the Muvango fame. I mean, Dumandlovu is the creator of Muvango, Uzalo, and a lot of these other, domestic soapies. So Duma was working for the Weekend World at the time. And he had this exclusive interview with Tsietsi Mashinini. Now, Tsietsi Mashinini had a message for students back in Soweto or in South Africa because the unrest has spread to other parts of the country. And Tiki, this is the message. I know a lot of people might think that I'm making this up, but this is the message, and it is there in black and white in the Weekend World. It would be the Weekend World of the last week of September, I think. And the message was that the ANC is defunct and the PAC is dead. Now, that is the message that, Tsietsi had, for students back in the country. And that message was supposed to be communicated to students in mass meetings by the next president of the SSRC. And that next president of the SSRC was Kgotso Seatlholo. Now, Kgotso Seatlholo became president at the end of August. And into September, he was planning the next, kind of action that students were going to take. We had gone back to school, but we were still planning what next are we going to do. The big issue here was that there were still students who were still in detention, and we really needed to have them released. So we planned another march into town. The first one was planned for the 14th of September, but it was aborted. The next one happened on the 22nd of September, and this one actually did happen. We marched into town. We managed to march down Commissioner Street, headed for John Foster Square. But baton charging policemen came, and precisely what we anticipated happened. Who was in the streets of Central Business District, Johannesburg at the time? It was white people. And if they were going to start shooting at us, there would have been collateral damage, which is why the police had to resort to batons rather than, live ammunition, as they had done in Soweto in June. The long and the short of it is that, the unrest was actually put down ultimately, and Kgotso was once again on the run. And sometime in October, he was able to leave the country. But before he left the country and before that march on the 2nd, Kgotso is the one who was able to communicate Mashinini's message to students. He came to Madibane High School, where in fact I was. And we had a very quick mass meeting with the students. And this is what Kgotso had to say to the students, that those of you who are feeling under threat at this stage, and it was early in September 1976, and you feel you want to leave the country, when you do, don't join the ANC, don't join the PAC. We are in the process of establishing an autonomous, independent student movement in exile, and we will do so. So that was the message. Now, I know yet again people will think I'm making this up, but it is true. It is there, and it happened. So what I'm saying here is, again, organizationally, any kind of link that people may think the mass movement had with the ANC would have been terminated at that point. And that was actually made quite explicit. So from September until the end of the year, for students in Soweto, it was, the year had come to an end. There was going to be no exams at the end of the year. The academic activities were completely suspended. And what it actually meant is that an academic year had gone down the tubes. We were expecting that in 1977, we will return and repeat the same grades we were in 1976. But this is important again, if I may actually capture this very quickly. Between September and December 1976, there were attempts not only by the government, to get things back into order. The government was trying to come up with a lot of, concessions, but none of them would actually appeal to us. The parents too were putting a lot of pressure on us that really we have to, come back to order, but we would have none of it. Now, MC Bueta, who was Minister of Bantu Education at the time, came up with a concession, and he said, okay, to save the academic year for 1976, we will allow you to prepare yourselves for exams from early January, the 5th of January 1977. The schools reopened, and we would prepare for exams which would sit in March, and they would be completed by the end of March. The new academic year for 77 would begin in April. Now, this was, and we are supposed to embrace this and say, well, this is a concession. This is saving the academic year. What this actually did was to split the student body, because some of us felt that, okay, we're not going to write these exams while other students are in detention. We're not going to write these exams because people have died for this. So this is a betrayal and we are not doing it. But a good number of students decided to take the offer. And when you think about Black education going down the tubes, the exams of 1977, which was a makeup exam for 1976, was actually the beginning of that process. This is when students went into exams with textbooks, and they could write that exam without being supervised. And that was the beginning. And I don't think it ever actually got better. So 1977 happened. The unfortunate part, and this is the most unfortunate, we had to have a new leadership. We have to revive the SSRC. Khotso Siyakholo had left the country. The student body was without leadership. The unfortunate thing that happened was the next president of the SSRC. Earlier, I talked about a group of students who would have been a little older to have been in high school, but were not employed. But there were other students who were in high school and a little older too, who were more likely to have a kind of recollection of the 1950s and had a sense of there had been the ANC. Unfortunately, the next president of the SSRC was just that kind of a person. Sechaba then Munzizi became that president. And he became president at the time when exams were written. And he was able to do things without, coming into focus. And we didn't know what was happening for a while until around April, when suddenly we read in the newspaper that the entire executive of the Soweto Student Representative Council was captured by the police at a house in Deep Kloof in Zone 6, and they were in police detention. And this included the president, Sechaba Den Munzizi. But then the reason for this arrest became clear pretty soon. It was not only that the executive of the SRC that was taken into custody from that house. They were in a meeting with members of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, the very body that Biko walked away from. And it was quite amazing, it was intriguing to us. How did this SSRC get to have a meeting with NUSAS when it had become quite clear that Black consciousness had steered itself away from the liberals, as we had characterized them? This was a stab in the back, but it had happened. The interesting thing is that among the NUSAS members who were taken into custody with the members of the SSRC, there was Max Price. For those of you who may have forgotten who Max Price was, Max Price very recently was the Vice Chancellor of UCT, but he was also the Dean of the Health Sciences at Wits until around 2006 or 2008. And these are the people who were in that meeting with Dan Munzizi and the SSRC. And the blow of the SSRC, the entire executive, being taken into custody was quite significant, because what that did was to disrupt, the student activities, and it actually disorganized the student body quite significantly. But again, to show that we had some kind of resilience, we are still able to reconstitute ourselves into a working student organization, and we're still able to once again come up with a working executive. And this time, the political pendulum swung to Diepkloof, and Diepkloof became the center of, many of the activities of the student movement at this time. And the president actually then did come from Madibane High School, who succeeded Sechaba Munzizi, and that was Trofomo Sono. Interesting how this name comes about. To this day, I still don't know what reformer means. But when we went back to school in 1977, we decided that, all the slave names, we are abandoning them. I decided I'm no longer Steve, I'm Malisala Lebelo. And of course, I am Malisala. So that became my official name. Gordon Sono was his name, but he did not have, an African name that he could use. And something that came to his mind was Trofomo. So he became Trofomo Sono. And he's still alive today. He lives in Diepkloof. He was the last president, of the SSRC, because he became president around May 1977, after Dan Munzizi and the others were detained. And then he became president until Black Wednesday, when the SSRC was banned, along with 17 other Black consciousness movement affiliates. And that was the end of the student movement. Here is an issue. Black Wednesday was a response to all the campaigns that I've spoken about from 1968 right down to 1977. What the apartheid state was doing was actually instituting a systematic assault on Black radicalism. Only this time, it was an organizational assault. It was an assault on organizations that were perpetrating Black radicalism. That was the first step of dealing with Black radicalism as a kind of phenomenon, as a phenomenon of liberation, and as a language of the liberation struggle. The second would actually, be to deal with the thought processes, the institutional framework. And this actually happens under a disguised, kind of dispensation. It happens under P.W. Botha. And what P.W. Botha does, is to bring up... Yes.
Can we leave some for next week? Can we leave some for next week, please? I see that you're on a roll, and I know my youth, they like things in little chunks. So thank you so much.
In fact, Tiki, it is perfect. This is the end of a phase. The next phase what we are going to be looking at is this, that when P.W. Botha comes in 78, this is what he tells white society, he tells the international community, that in fact what he's going to be concerned with is a total onslaught coming from the ANC. This is what he tells the South African public. He says the ANC, is an embodiment of a total onslaught that is directed at white supremacy. And to counter that, he said, we are going to institute a total strategy. But looking at total strategy, it had nothing to do with the ANC, because P.W. Botha knew that the ANC was taken care of. He knew he had it. What he was concerned about was the next mass movement inside the country, that it would not in any way be inspired by a black radical tradition. And for that reason, what did he do? He did not create the UDF. He vetted it, he allowed it, because the UDF would then become another counter to black radicalism. Let's talk about that next time.
Thank you. So we're going to do this every single Wednesday at 7 p.m. with Ndate Lebelo. So next week we're picking up from P.W. Botha, and then can we also, we'd like you to compare the youth structures over the decades, and to see where we are now. The youth of today, are they comparable to the youth leaders and structures of the past? So
to answer that, we'll go back to what Bisak had said. And I really needed to, I think we'll talk about that too.
Thank you. We'll talk next week. Please, let's save some for next week. Thank you, Moya Rice. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and join us on the Moya podcast. We have these new sessions. We're launching them tonight. Black Wednesday, a history of black radicals. And we're going to be with Ndate Mandisale every single Wednesday at 7 o'clock to really understand our history. Thank you to everybody who joined. We'll see you again next time.
Okay.